right. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar names in the attendee list and some unfamiliar names in the attendee list. We'll give it a minute to fill up because I know a lot of people have registered for the webinar today. We've had quite a lot of interest, which is very exciting. And then we'll get started because we have a lot to cover. I love this list. So good. And yes, we are recording. We have a playlist on YouTube for all of these Toolkit webinars. So once this one has been recorded, downloaded, uploaded back to YouTube, we will let you guys know, and it'll be part of that playlist.
We will also send out all of the links and resources that we use during the talk to make sure you have copies of all that as well. We'll just send out an email with everything.
Okay, I think we can get started and people can trail in as they get here. Hello, welcome to, I think, our fourth Toolkit webinar now. We have a good one today. We've gone through it last week and it's incredibly useful, so I hope it'll be useful for you guys as well. We're covering the customization process with the new publisher. So that's pretty much all you need to know. We released a from the ground up a rewritten publisher a little while back. The way that the hooks work with it, the plugins are a lot more flexible than they used to be in the past. And we have Josh Tomlinson, who is a senior Toolkit engineer who architected a lot of the ways the plugin system works, who's going to go through and actually set up a customization during the webinar. I'll mention that we have extensive docs on this stuff. We have our pipeline tutorial that you guys might be familiar with, has, again, by Josh, been rewritten, so it actually takes the new publisher into account, the new default config format into account, lots of good stuff. So today's pretty much going to be the Josh show. If you guys have questions, you can, there's like a questions panel, or you can type them into the chat. I'll be looking at either of those. Probably we will save most of the questions until the end, unless it's like a clarification that we need to do while we're going, and we can then interrupt Josh. But yeah, Josh, I will hand it over to you.
Sweet. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. Like Tanai says, I'm Josh, one of the Toolkit engineers. If I don't know you from the support channel, it's nice to meet you. I hope I get to meet you on there, although I kind of hope I don't, just because that means you have a support ticket. But either way, good to meet you. So what are we going to cover today? Like Tanai says, the publisher, the new publisher. It's been out for a while. We still call it the new publisher. I'll give you a quick overview of the features of it, the UI, just the basics, and then we'll get into the developer side. What are the concepts you need to know as a developer or somebody who's handling the configuration of the publisher? We'll look at how to build a custom workflow. We'll override some hooks and look at some code, and we'll try it out. I'll talk a little bit about some other features that are probably useful that I won't go into detail with, but at least you'll have exposure to those. We'll do a QA at the end, and then, like Tanai says, we'll send out all the materials afterwards. So let's get started. All I did just to get this prepped was to create a new project with a single shot. And I've done the advanced setup in Desktop 2 to get me a DEFCON 2 default configuration to set up in the back end of this project. So if you've done that before, that should be familiar. If not, then let us know. We can give you the background on that. But the end result is I have a project with a shot on it, and I've launched Maya, and so I've got that prepped and ready. And I've also got my configuration open in my IDE so that I can walk you guys through the different files that need to be modified and touched during the process. Another thing that I did that's really useful if you're doing development is to turn on debug logging. That can be done down here in the in desktop, and that's just really useful when you're doing development. So just one thing I wanted to point out as we get going. So let's talk about a little bit about the publisher basics. If I'm in Maya and I just click on the publish link or the publish action in the shotgun menu, in theory that should launch. Okay. Demo. Publish. There we go. So just a couple of quick features of the publisher that I want to point out, just so that everybody's got like a ground understanding of, ground level understanding of what the features are, what the different UI elements are. So we're all talking about the same thing. The left-hand side of the publisher is basically showing you what you're gonna publish, and we call those these items here. They're the top level, the larger rectangles that identify the thing that we want to publish in our workflow. Underneath those are the different actions that are going to be performed on the item. We call these tasks, and they correspond to plugins, which we'll look at later. On the right-hand side, you can see a detailed overview of the thing you're going to publish. You can create a thumbnail for it. You can type in a description, and you hit publish, and you're good to go. All this stuff gets sent out to Shotgun and written to disk, and all the various things you need to do in your workflow. The other big UI element that I want to point out is the logging view. If you can get to it by clicking on whatever message is down here at the bottom. And it's just going to show you the output that was performed during one of the phases of the publisher, whether it be the startup and collection phase or the publishing, which we'll see in a minute. And you'll notice the green output is there because we did turn on debug logging in desktop. So that's the very basics of the UI. Obviously, there's a lot more here, a lot more things you can do. You can drag and drop, which is another big feature that we added for Publish 2, so that you can build other types of workflows that weren't possible in Publish 1. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So now that we have kind of a basic understanding and a baseline of the UI, let's talk a little bit about development. There are some concepts in Publish 2 that before you start doing configuration and writing custom hooks and plugins, you need to kind of understand what those are. In terms of the way that I think about the publisher, there's really two halves of the publisher. There's the collection phase, or the collection half, and then there's the publishing half. If you can have your mental model break down into those two areas, then it makes it a lot easier to understand. And the thing that sort of sits in the middle of those two are the items themselves, the things that show up on the left-hand side of the UI. So the first half we'll talk about is the collector half. And what the collector half does is, if you're familiar with Publish 1, just to help you kind of make that mental transition, the collector is basically the scan scene, or the thing that looks into your current session, whatever that may be, Maya or Houdini or Nuke. And there is code that runs in these collector hooks that says, what are the things that the user might care about? What are the things that I can present to them to publish? So there's two different methods that you need to know about in this particular half of the publisher, the collector half. One is process current session. This is the one that runs if you're in Maya, if you're in Nuke, if you're in Houdini, the one that says, I'm going to use whatever the API is for that piece of software, and I'm going to ask it questions about what are the geometries or the lights or the file itself or anything that I want to publish in my workflow. The second one is process file, and this is the one that runs when you drag a file into the publisher, and it operates on it to see what it's called, what type of file it is, and basically collects information about the file to present to the user. You can see on the left-hand side in this little screenshot here that the collector creates these items here, and underneath those items are plugins, and that's the second half of the collection, which is the publishing half. And the cool thing about the Publish To is that you can define any number of plugins and build the logic inside of them that says, how do I, or build the logic that says, this is how I perform an action on a particular type of item. And once we get into the code, I'll show you how that connection is made between the Publish plugin and the items that are collected. So the four methods that you need to kind of know about on the Publish side, we had the two on the collector side, and then we have these four main ones on the Publish side, are accept, which is I'm interested in this item for publishing. I'm going to set the plugin into a state that makes it clear to the user what this plugin is going to do, and I also have the chance or the opportunity to reject this item if I want to. Validate says this item in its current state within the DCC, within Maya or Nuke, is in a state where I can actually publish it. This can be run manually, but it's also run before each publish, which is the Publish method, which is the one that actually does the work. It's the business logic for getting your item from whatever state it's in your session, whether it be in a file that already exists on disk or something that needs to be exported first. And says, let's get that onto disk. Let's make sure it's on disk in the right state. Or let's upload some data to Shotgun, whatever that operation is. And then finalize, which is typically used as a cleanup or a way to get your session back into a state where your artist can continue working or do whatever they want to do. And those are the big concepts in terms of, the mental model of how Publish To works. So if you've got that you've got that sort of framed in now, and I think we can start looking at how the configuration and how to override some of this in our workflow. So I'm going to go over to the config on disk. So the first thing I want to look at and want to show you guys is in the env folder in my config. If I go into includes and then under settings, I'm going to look at the Publish To settings file, and this is where all of, by default, in the default configuration that we ship, this is where all of the Publish To specific settings will live, regardless of what context or environment I'm working in. And this is something we talked about in the last webinar, where we've in the configuration taken and tried to put everything in a place where it makes the most sense. So if you're trying to do custom configuration on Publish To using the default custom settings on the publisher in the default configuration, or a derivative of it, if you've customized it, then it's going to live in this file. And if you're at the top, what you're going to do is look for, in this particular case, what we're looking at is customizing Maya. So I'm just going to scroll down to the Maya section, and I'll see two different configurations of the Publish To. I've got the asset and the shot step. So let's look at specifically the settings for Publish To, the things that, as a pipeline administrator or a developer, the things that you're going to care about when you go in here and you start making changes to the publisher. We talked about the two halves of the publisher and the things that you need to do in terms of things you need to know about in terms of making changes. We talked about the collector. This is a hook. So if you're familiar with customizing Toolkit, this is a piece of code, some business logic that runs that customizes the behavior. We ship the default publisher with this setup, which is, if you notice the colon here, that indicates that this is a hook collection of hooks, and there's a inheritance implied here. So we have the collector that ships with the app itself. Self is a way of saying basically the Publish To's collector, so the one that ships with the app. And then for our Maya configuration, we're inheriting that base collector, and we're adding some additional logic for Maya specific collection. So anything that's Maya specific that you want to look into a Maya session and look for, if you want to use the MEL or the Maya commands API, then that logic would live in here. The base collector has logic. If you remember the drag and drop, all that kind of logic lives in the base collector, so you don't have to re-implement it every time you're making changes to an engine or you're writing your own custom collection code. We also have the collector settings. The settings is essentially the interface to the collector that you can provide as a developer. You can provide to the configuration. So if you want to reuse your collector in different ways, in different environments or different settings, you can provide this and expose that to the configuration. So in this example, we see that the collector makes use of the Maya shot work template. If you look at the asset step up here, the same collector is configured, but it's using a different template, the asset work. The next setting here is really the interesting one in terms of Toolkit. Historically, hooks have been been represented as a single setting in the configurations, and Publish 2 introduces this notion of a list of hooks that you provide, any number of, and this is what we call the Publish plugins. So what this is, it's a list which defines a bunch of these hook definitions. We give them names so that they show up in a certain way that we want them to in the Publish UI. And they also have settings which are much the same as the collector settings. They expose an interface to that hook that you can use in different ways in different configurations. So I think what I want to do right now is just show you, if we go back into Maya, and I've got my session here, if I were to, just as an example, create a sphere and say publish, all I see here is the Maya session that I'm going to publish, and I'm just going to publish it to Shotgun. That's the only plugin that's attached to this particular item type. And so what that means is the collector found, or because it's in Maya, it's automatically going to collect the session, and then it's going to offer that item up to all of the configured plugins. And the one that decided to attach itself to that item is this one. This is the Publish Session plugin. It inherits from the base file publisher, which means it gets a lot of the default logic for just registering the publish and Shotgun, handling templates and copying from a work template to a publish template. All that stuff is defined in there. And then the Maya Publish Session inherits from that and implements all the Maya specific stuff, like making sure the file is saved and doing all kinds of checks like that. And you can always go into the Maya engine code and then look at that if you need more details, or just ask us at a later point. We'll help walk you through that. But the basics here is that the default case is just publishing that Maya session. What I want to do is give you an example. In the asset step, we have this Publish Session Geometry plugin, which is not available in the shop by default. And all this does is say, if you have geometry in your session, we will publish it to disk as a big giant Alembic cache. And so just as an example of what you can do, I'm going to copy that down here to the shot step, and just to give you an idea of how easy it is to make changes here. I'm going to go to my Work Area Info app in the Shotgun menu, and I'm going to reload. That's going to reevaluate the plugins that are configured here. And now I can publish, and I see that because I have that sphere here, this other publish plugin has attached itself to it, and it's now available to publish. The other thing that I'll point out as well is that this item is parented underneath the session item, and this is just by convention. It's not a anything that's hard-coded into the publisher. You can configure this and set your collector up to parent your items in any way that makes sense to you. What this also implies is that this Maya collector here has logic in it to collect Alembic caches, even though there was no plugin configured here. And that's another nice thing you can do that helps save you some effort down the road, is you can be pretty liberal in terms of collecting items for publishing, as long as they're not expensive to calculate. And I'll get to an example of this when we start customizing the actual code, but the same collector is configured in both scenarios. It's collecting a bunch of stuff, and you know, in different scenarios, depending on the published plugins that you have configured, some of those will kick in and some of them won't, depending on your workflow. So it just is a nice thing that's in there as well. So I'm going to undo that change, get back to our default state here, and move on to I think the most interesting part, which is, you know, how do we actually customize the publisher to do something that it doesn't do by default? So let's take a look at that process, which is probably familiar if you've done Publish One in terms of, you know, overriding a hook and any of the other Toolkit apps. But I'm just going to walk through all the steps and give you some pointers, and hopefully it'll be useful. So the first thing we want to do is if we're talking about workflow, let's just pick something that is pretty typical in a studio workflow. And in this case, what I'm going to do is talk about cameras. So by default, we don't have any camera publishing that ships with Toolkit. So let's look at collecting some cameras and publishing them for folks downstream. To do this, what I'm going to do is start by customizing the collector. Now, if you remember, we have the applications collector and we have the Maya specific collector that inherits from that. There's two approaches we can take here. One, we could do something like this, where we have a collector that we define in our configuration. Let's just say we did something like this. So this is one approach where we, let me talk quickly about this token here, config. Each of these tokens is a shorthand for a hooks folder. This is the hook folder that lives in the app. This is the hooks folder that lives in the engine. And this is the hooks folder that lives in our configuration. In other words, this folder here. We could take this approach to customizing the collector by saying we're going to not make any changes to the Maya collector. We're going to basically add a new collector that inherits from the Maya collector and only adds the camera collection. That's totally valid, and it will save you if you don't want to touch this particular implementation and you want to get updates from the Maya engine as that engine evolves and that collection changes. The example that I have set up right now, we're just going to override completely the engine collector. So what we're going to do is simply change this from engine to config, and we're going to copy that Maya collector into our configuration. An easy way to do this is to, if you look next to your config folder, there's an install folder. If you drill down in here and you look for the Maya engine, you'll find that there may be one or more versions installed here. If you take the latest one and you go into the hooks folder, you can find the hook that you want to override. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this collector, and I'm going to recreate this folder structure in my configuration. So I'm going to do it by shell because it'll be much faster. I'm going to make that folder structure here. So I've got TK multi-publish 2, basic, and I've added a Maya in here just in case we wanted to at some point override a different engine. So I'm going to paste that in there. And now I've overridden the engine or the collector for this publisher in Maya's shot step environment with the one that comes from the configuration. So I've got TK multi-publish 2, basic Maya collector. And because I added that little namespacing folder in here. I'm going to save that. So if we now open that collector, we can start making changes. Now I don't want to bore you with the nitty-gritty details of that, so I've got it all ready to just cut and paste in here. And what I will do is walk you through some of the things that changed. So again, we've just taken the whole collector, and we've rewritten the code. And the result of that is, this is not right. Sorry. Let me do this again. Sorry, real quickly. Copy, paste. And I'm going to copy this in here. Sorry about that. Okay, so I've got my updated code in here. And let me double check. Yep, that's still good. Okay, so all that changed in here, the only code that's changed is, if you remember the two methods we talked about, the process current session, which operates within the DCC, or whatever your current software is. We've modified that method and just added a call here to collect cameras. And we've implemented a method at the bottom called collect cameras. And what this does is it says, let's iterate over all the cameras in the file. Let's see if we can figure out the best name to use to display them to the user. And let's create items for them. Now this is the key bit here. We talked about items in the very beginning when we looked at that overview of the publisher. This is the thing that the user will see. We're going to, I'll talk about this in a second. We're going to call this, we're going to give this just a display type of camera. We're going to give it a name so the user knows which camera we're talking about. And we're going to give this a string called item filters. Now the item filter is the contract between the collector and the published plugins that says, here's the category of this thing, and the published plugins will say, I know what I want to operate on. And the item filter that the published plugins will look for could be some wildcard string that matches this, or a list of these. So we'll look at that on the other side, and I think it'll make more sense. But just keep in mind that this is essentially the contract that allows the items collected to be acted upon, or to be accepted by the published plugins on the other side. A couple of other things here. We're defining an icon for these camera items, and we are setting that icon on each item that we collect. And finally, we're using this properties dictionary that exists on any items that you create, which is really handy for basically just putting information into and attaching it to the item that can be used later on by the published plugins. So it can be basically any data that you want to store in there that you may or may not need on the other end when the published plugin takes it and it begins to act on it. In this case, we're going to store the name of the camera and the shape, the Maya shape that goes along with it. The other thing that I want to point out too is you'll notice that items are created by calling the create item method on a parent. So in this case, we have the parent item, which is the session, and we have the item that we're creating, the camera, will be parented to it just simply by calling the create item on the parent. If you didn't want to, the parent item being passed in here is the Maya session because of the way this is written. It doesn't have to be. You can create a top level item with the item that's passed into the process current session. So this would be the root of the left-hand side. So any items created under this, like the session item, will be at the root of your hierarchy. And then when you call, if you want to parent underneath something, like in this case, this is the session item. It's being passed to the cameras. They'll all be underneath the session item. Another thing that's useful that we'll add in here now is to log, add a debug logging call to basically show us that these cameras are being collected and they will be available to publish plugins. So I can say self is the hook. There's a logger property on that, and we're going to say collected camera, and then camera name. Okay, so in theory, if we plug this in, then we should see as these items are being collected, they'll show up in our log. So we've got everything configured here. We've got our overridden collector configured. So if we save this and we go over to Maya, I'm going to remember to reload our engines and apps. And if we go open the publisher, now we don't see anything here, and that's because we haven't added any plugins that will attach themselves to cameras yet. But if we go back into our logging output, you'll see here collected camera front, collected camera perspective, blah, blah, blah. And so that just gives us some validation that the items are being collected, and now we can move on to writing a plugin that will connect to those cameras and present them to the user and allow us to publish them. Let me show one more thing. Yeah, okay, never mind. Okay. Okay, now let's look at the plugin side of things. So what we're going to need to do is add, just like we did with the session geometry, we're going to add a new call here, a new plugin here that we're going to write, but we'll go ahead and add the configuration first, and then we can write the plugin. So this will be this one. And so let's look at this. We've got, we're going to write a publish plugin, and we'll just call it publish to shotgun, and we will put it here. It will be called publish camera, and we will inherit from the base file publisher, so that'll handle a lot of the publish registration, the template handling, all that stuff. It'll do it for us. And the responsibility of this plugin will just be to export the camera to disk. We've given it two settings, which I'll show you in a second, but basically we have a publish template that says this is where we're going to be writing these cameras to disk. And we've also added this cameras setting, which is essentially a filter that the publish plugin will implement that says these are the cameras that we care about. So it's a way of configuring the publish plugin to only show the user cameras that are maybe named a certain way, like whatever your studio convention is for cameras that are passed downstream. I'm just going to change that now to cam star, so that any camera we create called cam something will get presented to the user. So let's go ahead and do that, write that custom plugin. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to add a new file here. We'll call it publish camera.py. Again, this is in the same spot as our plugin here, basic Maya collector publish to. And now we can actually take the code for this, which is this one. Okay. And again, you'll have access to all this so you can see the details, but I'm going to walk you through just a couple of bullet points to help you get a feel for what it's doing. You can, in your published plugins, you can do a lot of things to customize the way it looks inside of the interface. You can give it a description, you can give it settings. The settings interface is the one that shows up in the configuration here. So these two. So if we look at this particular plugin that we've got, we've exposed these two. We've talked about the types, or we've given the types of those settings. So template, and then we've got a list. We've got a default value if none is supplied in the configuration, and we're also inheriting the settings from this one. So that's that pattern is repeated throughout the shipped plugins. So anytime that you want to inherit plugins from the parent, inherit settings from the parent plugin, you can follow this pattern. Okay, now here's the item filters we looked at before. Yep.
Hey, Josh.
Yep.
Before you go forward, I was going to ask, KP had a question. Hi, KP. That seems like it's relevant to the stuff that you were talking to a second ago.
Okay.
In the collect cameras method, why do you need to specify the camera name on the properties again after calling create item, which already provides the camera? Yeah, so the way I think about this is pretty much the display. Now, we could totally access the camera name from the item in the published plugins if we wanted to. So this is a little bit redundant, but just as an example, this is really the display of it, the way I think about it. And then any properties that you want, any additional metadata you want to store for the camera, you can do it here. But yeah, KP is right. This is a little bit redundant if you know that this item's name matches the camera name. Cool. Thanks. So the item filters is, again, this is the contract. This is the way that the initial, as the items are provided to the registered plugins to see if the plugins want to act on them, this is the initial connection point between the items and the plugins. So if you remember in the collector, we gave it a type of Maya session camera. Here we have the published plugin looking for items of that type with the item filter set that way. So we know for a fact that this published plugin is at least going to be interested in any camera items. Just to point this out, and as the docs say here, you can write plugins that look for a wildcard matched type. So for example, you could have a plugin that operates on anything Maya.star or Maya session.star. So it could operate on cameras, geometry, anything that's in your session. And then of course the explicit call here. You can also provide a list. So you can say Maya.star, file.maya, etc. So it's just a flexible way of creating that contract or that connection between collected items and published plugins. The accept method says, okay, I'm interested. Now I need to do a little bit more digging. If the item filters don't match, there is no further processing of the item with regard to that published plugin. If this is a match, then the accept method will run before it's displayed in the UI, and it will do some additional checks to make sure that the item has everything that's expected. For example, the properties that it expects to be in there, a whole bunch of other stuff that it goes through, make sure it can figure out the published template and all that. And it can also set the state of the item. So if you remember, the items have checkboxes. It can set the check state of that, whether it's enabled, whether it's visible. You can kind of customize the look of the published plugins for your user if you want to. It's just a way to make it sort of make the UX a little bit cleaner. If you want to do different things, you can do that with the accept method. And then of course the validate method, which will make sure that before the publish actually happens, that the state of the camera is, the camera item in the session is ready to go. It will do everything it needs to do to make sure that before the publish runs, it has the best chance of success is really the way I think about it. And that'll run, again, every time you push the publish button before the publish runs, or you can do it manually in the interface inside of the publisher.
And then, of course, the publish method. In this case, we're writing an FBX file. We're exporting an FBX file to a path that's evaluated from the publish template and the work template. And then the nice thing is, like I was saying before, is we call the base class publish method, which will, if we've set up all the properties correctly on the item. So in this case, we set the publish type, and the publish path is defined in the accept method, and because we've already processed it there to make sure that everything's in the right place. And once you have all that item property set up, the base publish plugin has all the logic in there for registering it with Shotgun, making sure files are copied from work to publish path. In this case, we don't need to do that because we're actually writing to the publish path. But I'll show you that a little bit later. There's a lot of stuff in there already to help you kind of on your way to writing publish plugins. And then logic for making sure that the name matches and everything. And so at this point, we've got our publish plugin. We should be configured over here with our publish camera. And the other thing that we need to do is, because we've defined this Maya shot camera publish, we need to actually add that new template for camera publishes to our core config core templates.yaml. So I'm just going to go find the Maya shot templates, and I'm going to add a new one in here. And it is this one. Okay, Maya shot camera publish. It's going to be written to the shot root publish Maya cameras, and then it's got the same syntax as the other files, other than the FBX is on the end. So we've got name and a version. So we should be good there. And we've got this configured. And now let's see if we've got it all done correctly. I'm going to first create a camera that will match our naming convention that we define in the settings. So cam should match cam star. Now I'm going to reload my apps and engines. And if I now launch the publisher, oh, it doesn't show up. This is good. That means we have a problem. So how do we debug this? If we go to an easy way to do, there's a couple of ways. First, you can look at the output from the Maya console, the Maya script editor. I don't see anything obvious that's sticking out in here. So what I'm going to do is go to desktop, and I'm going to go to, I'm going to go up here and say, show me the log folder. This is taking me to the Shotgun logs folder, which has all of the logs. If I do sort by date, the most recent one should be the Maya log. And I can look in here for error. Let's see if I can find out what it is. Okay. This last one, this publish camera does not exist. Okay. So if we go back and double check our path, we can see TK Maya publish. We have our hooks. Sorry. Config hooks. TK multi-publish 2. That's good. You can see, oh, basic Maya. So we need to do this. Basic/Maya. So now, go back into Maya. We can try to reload again. Work area info, reload engine and apps. When that's done, we've got our publish back, so we should be good. And look at that. Okay, we've got our camera in there. Our icon is not there. Let's see if we can fix that. So if you remember in our collector, we have the icon, which is supposed to be here. So let's evaluate this. Self is the hook. The disk location of the hook is here. We're going to go up one directory, and it's expecting an icons/camera.png. So if we go up one from our disk location, and we're going to create a new folder called icons. And I have a camera icon ready to go. So now let's do our reload again one more time and we should be good. Close this, and there we go. Got our camera icon now. So in theory, we can run our validate to see if everything is good to go. We can go back here and check our debug logs. So you can see some of the debug output that exists in that publish plugin. It says camera name, top, front, perspective, side. Don't match the configured pattern. So that's our pattern matching logic that we put in there. And you can see other debug output for the cameras here. It looks like it's going to write to this file, which looks good. So if I close this and then push publish, it'll go through all the steps. It will do the validation. It will publish it, and we can go back to our logs here to make sure that everything published correctly. And it looks like everything did, and that's good news. I think that's the bulk of what I wanted to cover in terms of customizing and the configuration in the publisher. I'm going to try and leave 10 minutes for questions. So let me just do a quick summary. We looked at the basics of the publisher. We talked about the concepts in Publish 2 in terms of the developer overview, the collection half and the publishing half. We looked at the settings, the hooks, the collector, the publish plugins, you know, being able to add and remove plugins depending on what you want the workflow to be. We did the example with the geometry, just copying and pasting, just to see how that configuration works. And we also did a custom collector, and we did a custom publish plugin, and we looked at a little bit of how to debug that. And I want to talk about just a couple more features of the publisher before we go that I think are interesting. I talked about the base file publisher plugin. So this is the one that comes with Publish 2 by default. It's the base, I call it the base publish file plugin, because it's the one that almost all the default, regardless if you're in Maya or Nuke or Houdini, they all use this as the backbone of publishing. And this has all the logic that you need to get stuff into Shotgun from disk. And it also has, like I said, logic from copying work file to publish template. And the key here is if you're creating an item in your custom collector and in your custom plugins, you can set properties on it. You remember where we set the camera name and the camera shape? You can set certain properties that this base publish plugin knows about to help drive how that behavior, or to help basically give you the functionality that you need without having to do the work yourself. So you can provide a work template, you can provide a publish template, you can override the publish type, the path, the name, and the version, dependencies, all that stuff. If you set it on the properties and then call the base class, this will do a lot of the work for you. So I encourage you, if you are writing a custom publish plugin that deals with files on disk that you want to get into Shotgun and you want to get into, you want to get it registered, just to look at this base publish file plugin and just kind of read through the comments in here, and it will, in the doc strings, and it will help you along your way. And of course, all the other shipped integrations will have examples of how to use this as well. The other things that I wanted to point out in the docs are in the items, in the publish plugins, there are methods that allow you to customize the way that the UI looks. So let me bring up another instance here. If you click on a publish plugin, by default, you get the description. You're not limited to just this description. You can write your own Qt code that will show up in here and give users options for driving how that publish plugin behaves. So if you scroll, we didn't look at examples of those, but if you scroll down here in the publish plugins API, there's 3 methods. There's the create settings widget, there's the get UI settings, and then there's the set UI settings methods. And each of those are part of the puzzle to that are required for creating your own UI that the users can interact with, and you can drive, in addition to your configuration, drive how those things are output to disk or to whatever it is you're doing. And then finally, the logging actions. If you click on the logging in here, you may have seen it when I was going through the publisher. You may have seen these little buttons that show up on the right. There are several different types of these that are very useful for debugging, or for, in this case, we want to see the published data, just a dictionary of published data that gets uploaded to Shotgun. If you want to be able to jump directly to a publish in Shotgun, you can do that. There's just a whole bunch of ways to customize the publisher to help either you or your artists if they're having trouble. If you have a particular issue that you run into during validation that you can fix with a simple Python method, like a geometry is busted and you want to fix it, try a quick fix, you can do that. You can copy stuff to the clipboard for debugging. There's all kinds of really cool stuff in here that you should look over if you're writing a custom plugin. And yeah, I think that's it. I'm gonna turn it back over to Tanaz, and she can go through the questions.
All right, we have a couple that I answered, but I'll mention them quickly. One does the new publisher have to work inside of a DCC, or can I launch it from desktop? And the answer there, of course, is yes. You can launch it from desktop, and you can do these same customizations for the TK desktop engine. I don't know, Josh, if you want to say anything more about that.
Yeah, so the one thing about the standalone publisher is you can do a lot of different things with it that don't come shipped out of the box. You can implement, by default, we don't implement the process current session for the standalone publisher, but you totally could. You can implement whatever the engine is, whether it's desktop or whatever. You can do all kinds of things that don't come out of the box. You can drive your drag and drop with templates. We've helped folks do that before. So it's really flexible in terms of customization. So yeah, if you have ideas or questions, feel free to hit us up about specifics.
Okay, great. Scott is asking if there's any idea when the Publish To will support command line option.
So we have tickets internally that we've been talking about, and we know that there is a desire for a UI or an API that lives outside of the scope of the UI that you can call into and do publishing and all that kind of stuff, and maybe build command line tools around. But we haven't started that yet. It's not there yet. But we do know that desire exists.
And then follow up to that: are the Toolkit apps callable from the Toolkit Manager?
Toolkit Manager. I'm not sure what that means.
So maybe Bootstrap? Is that what you're talking about, Scott?
Oh.
Correct. Yes.
If you've bootstrapped into a toolkit, into a SGTK context, you should be able to access whatever. If you bootstrapped an engine, you should be able to access any apps that are configured for that engine in that environment and call them directly. I think so. Yeah.
Great. And then the last question we have, it's from Anonymous, and it's I think it's a question about distinguishing between warnings and errors. That sometimes what you think is a warning is actually stopping the flow of the publish. So maybe you treat it as an error, and how you treat those different, or display those differently, treat them differently, etc. Yeah,
I think I've noticed that occasionally too. I think what we need to do is just maybe another pass on making sure we're getting that those colors correct. I think it's a support request, I think.
Okay, I will make a note of that one then. Do we have any more questions? That's all. Oh, wait, one more just came in. What is this? Is it a big challenge to use Publisher 2 if you're using the old project config setup? So if you're in the old default?
Publish to is just like any other app. So in theory, you can configure it just fine in the old. There's nothing about the old configuration that prevents you from setting up Publish to in there. I think right now we're using the new default to structure for our configuration. So it just means you have to kind of backport your brain from default to back to the old configuration. But in terms of the configuration itself, it should be totally possible.
Cool. Nico is asking, are subscriptions on the roadmap?
Hi, Nico. I don't know if they're on the roadmap in terms of right this minute. We're certainly not working on a subscription system, but it's always something in our minds that would be nice to have. If that answers the question.
And then one more follow-up from Scott. So going back to bootstrapping TK, can you then run it from the command line without Qt being launched? So command line workaround.
I think it depends on the engine. If the engine has Qt running, then yes. Does that sound right, Manny?
Hi guys. Yeah, that was just what I was going to say. So depending on the engine, they will handle that case differently. If it's the shell engine, for example, it's able to launch both Qt and non-Qt applications. So it will sort of gracefully fall back. As soon as you request a dialog, it will initialize the kind of Qt and kind of level up the engine to use Qt. So shell engine is a good starting point there.
I will post a link in the chat. Rob is kind of looking in the background. He's being a hero today. He's here even though he's under the weather, but he was quick to point out regarding Daniel's question about putting Publisher 2 in the old config that we actually do have a document that can help you with that. So I just pasted that in. Let's see. Oh, the last one is just thanks, guys. Okay, so that's all the questions we have. If we're done, then I guess we're done. Thanks, Josh. That was awesome. And like I said, we'll follow up with the recording and we'll follow up with links to this documentation, to the tutorial, all that relevant stuff. And I'll also mention like the way in which we sort of broadcast knowledge about, like broadcast the fact that we're doing these webinars is the Shotgun Dev Google group, which is awesome. We're also on Facebook, we're on Twitter. We're on LinkedIn apparently as well, and we have our own Shotgun Software blog. So if you guys want to follow any of those things, you can get lots of great information. All right, I think we're good. Thanks for taking the time in your day. See you all at the next one.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, guys.